All right, let's just jump right in. If you think you've got a handle on the roles of global power and conflict, well, I gotta tell you, the entire game has changed. Everything we thought we knew, from the battlefield to the economy, all the way to our own minds, it's all being run by a totally new and honestly often invisible set of principles.
And this quote, man, it just nails the feeling of the era we're in right now, doesn't it? We're caught in this chaotic, unpredictable transition period, like we're in a gap between two completely different worlds. And it's in these kinds of gaps that new threats, new powers, and totally new ways of thinking start to emerge.
So here's the absolute core of it all, the most crucial point. Building and maintaining systems, I'm talking about an army, a global supply chain, or even just a stable society, it takes a ton of energy, resources, and cooperation. But tearing them down, that's cheap. That's practically free. And this simple idea, this is the strategic reality that's going to shape everything we talk about next.
Okay, let's start with the change you can see most clearly. Warfare. Seriously, forget everything you think you know about front lines and conquering territory. The how of modern conflict has been completely upended by technology.
You see, the new objective isn't about rolling tanks into a capital city anymore. The goal is what the source material calls systemic collapse. It's all about targeting an enemy's nervous system, their logistics, their financial networks, their communications, and making it totally impossible for them to function. I mean, why occupy a country if you can make it collapse from the inside out?
So how do you actually pull off that kind of systemic paralysis? Well, you do it by attacking the enemy's brain, their ability to make decisions. In military strategy, this is known as the OODA loop, and this fundamental cycle is now the #1 target in any modern conflict. Think about it. An army has to observe what's happening, orient itself to all the new information, decide on a plan, and then act. But modern cyber and information warfare, they're designed to break every single step of that process. If you can flood your enemy with bad data, they can't observe correctly. If they can't observe, they can't orient. And if they can't orient, well, they're not deciding or acting on anything. The result? Total paralysis.
Now, think back to 20th century warfare for a second. It was all defined by these massive, incredibly expensive pieces of hardware, right? Aircraft carriers, fighter jets, tanks, platforms that cost millions, sometimes billions of dollars. That was how you measured power.
But what happens when the entire economy of war gets flipped on its head? What's the new price tag for power? $1,000. That's what's so revolutionary. It's just mind-boggling. For about the price of a new smartphone, a single AI-equipped drone can take out or disable a multi-million-dollar system. This is what the source calls asymmetric scale, the power of the small and cheap to completely dominate the large and expensive. And this just brilliantly shows how this soldier is changing too. See, massed units, big groups of soldiers packed together, are now basically just an open buffet for drone swarms. It's a suicide mission. So the soldier of the future becomes a lone warrior, an individual operator, physically separate, but constantly plugged into a bigger network, a digital backbone. They're like a data-driven node on the battlefield.
Okay, so we've covered the how of modern conflict. Now let's shift gears and talk about the why, because the reasons we fight are changing just as dramatically as the way we fight.
The great conflicts of the last century, they were all driven by these huge ideas: communism versus capitalism, democracy versus fascism. But that era, the time of these grand ideological battles, it's pretty much over. The new conflicts, they're way more primal. They're about controlling the actual physical ingredients that power our digital world.
And this is what they're fighting for. The new grand prize is what's being called material sovereignty. It's about locking down control of the physical stuff our tech future is built on. Things like lithium for batteries, cobalt, rare earth elements. But look at this visual. It's suggesting even something as basic as water becomes a strategic resource, not for drinking, but for cooling the massive data centers that run our AI. Just think about that. A fight for computational power could literally become a fight for control over rivers.
We've hit the physical battlefield and the resource battlefield. But there's a third, and you could argue it's the most dangerous front of all, and it's the one taking place right between your ears. This is the war for your mind. The weapon here isn't a bullet or a bomb. It's an algorithm. The source calls it neuropropaganda. It's about using social media and all that big data not to persuade you with logic, but to basically find a backdoor around your rational brain and directly poke the emotional centers, the parts of you that feel, not the parts that think. And the specific psychological tactic is called amygdala hijacking. Your amygdala is the ancient part of your brain that processes fear and anger.
By constantly pumping out content that triggers these primal emotions in a population, you can literally shatter a society's shared reality. You make cooperation and even basic problem solving impossible. And the end goal of all of this is cognitive paralysis. It's the same idea as breaking the OODA loop to paralyze an army, but on a societal scale. When nobody can agree on what's real anymore, when every single piece of information feels suspect, a country just loses its ability to make collective decisions. It just freezes. And here's the really insidious part, what this quote gets at so perfectly. This kind of control, it works best when we volunteer for it, when we retreat into our own little information bubbles and algorithmic echo chambers because it feels safe, it feels comfortable, all while we're being completely manipulated. So, where does this all leave us? We've got digital battlefields, we've got wars over raw materials, and we have this constant assault on our own minds. Let's try and pull this all together into one final big idea. The author calls this the age of the digital Leviathan. It's a new kind of all-encompassing power. But instead of being based on land or who has the biggest army, it's based on who controls the digital infrastructure, who controls the data flowing through it, and who controls the raw materials that make it all run. In this new world, the source material makes a really stark argument. There are only two roles you can play. You're either the merchant or you're the resource. The merchant is the one with the strategic mind, the one who understands and manages these complex systems. The resource, well, that's the thing being used, whether it's the lithium in the ground or the data from your phone. Put simply, you either sit at the table or you are on the table. Which brings us right to our final thought. The fundamental reasons for conflict, fear, greed, the quest for power, they're as old as humanity itself. That's the ancient soul of war. But its body, its form, is now completely digital. So the ultimate question for all of us is, how do we navigate this new reality? How do we make sure the future we want is one that's built with intention and strategy, instead of one we just accidentally stumble into?